And this is a reading of the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 44, titled The Shorter Classification. And this is a conversation or question and answer between the layman Visaka and his former wife, the nun Dhammadhina. Visaka, he practiced so well that he became a non-returner. So there are 4 stages of enlightenment in early Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism. So the first stage is that of a Sotapanna, one whose mind has seen the truth but is not yet quite ready to fully rest in the truth of pure awareness or pure consciousness, without any grasping. So he or she is said to have 7 more lifetimes, but they are no longer destined for woeful states of rebirth. So we have to understand what is rebirth. Rebirth is really about our mind states, our thoughts and our feelings and perception. So there are some books that say, there are woeful places in the universe, and these are like birds of a feather that flock together. If people with negative mind states come together, they share the same belief. So together they create a form of hell for one another. So this is what is meant by the states of mind, creating our states of location after death, or even so-called, during our present life. So the next 2 stages of enlightenment are that of a Sakadagami, the once returner, and the non-returner, the Anagami. So these 2 states of mind are also enlightened mind. So one only need to return to the physical form once more, and the other one has no more need to create the physical form as a form of expression for consciousness. So these 2 states of mind have reduced craving for sensual pleasures. They also have reduced feelings of aversion, and they have wise knowledge and less ignorant, which is actually associated with neutral feelings. So of course, the last stage of enlightenment in Theravada Buddhism is that of an arahant. So nun Dhammadhina was very upset one day when her husband came home. Her husband, layman Visaka, he no longer had any much desire for sexual intimacy as a non-returner. So she was really upset. But fortunately, she became a disciple of the Buddha instead of blaming the Buddha. And who knew, right, that her mind was ripe for enlightenment, and she attained the state of arahantship, a much so-called higher mind level, or not say higher mind level, but a greater release of the mind and heart from sorrow, free from sorrow, right? So the non-returner still has certain grasping of greed, delusion, and ignorance. There's still a bit left, so there is still some sorrow there. So I'll start reading the sutta now. It is a conversation about meditation and the path of practice. So it can be a little hard to understand if you're not a Buddhist, but if you are, and if you're a meditator, you will enjoy this sutta like I do. So I have heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Rajagaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrels' feeding ground. Then the layman Visaka went to see the nun Dhammadhina, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to her, "Ma'am, they speak of this thing called identity. What is this identity that the Buddha spoke of?" Visaka, the Buddha said that these 5 grasping aggregates are identity. That is, form, feeling, perception, choices, or thought forms, and consciousness. The Buddha said that these 5 grasping aggregates are identity. Saying, "Good man," Visaka approved and agreed with what Dhammadhina said. Then he asked another question. Ma'am, they speak of this thing called the origin of identity. What is the origin of identity that the Buddha spoke of? It's the craving that leads to future lives, mixed up with relishing and greed, chasing pleasure in various realms. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving to continue existence, and craving to end existence. The Buddha said that this is the origin of identity. Ma'am, they speak of this thing called the cessation of identity. What is the cessation of identity that the Buddha spoke of? It's the fading away and cessation of that very same craving with nothing left over, giving it away, letting it go, releasing it, and not adhering to it. The Buddha said that this is the cessation of identity. Ma'am, they speak of the practice that leads to the cessation of identity. What is the practice that leads to the cessation of identity that the Buddha spoke of? The practice that leads to the cessation of identity that the Buddha spoke of is simply this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion. Immersion is another word for absorption or concentration. But ma'am, is that grasping the same exact thing as the 5 grasping aggregates? Or is grasping one thing and the 5 grasping aggregates another? That grasping is not the exact thing as the 5 grasping aggregates, nor is grasping one thing and the 5 grasping aggregates another. The desire and greed for the 5 grasping aggregates is the grasping there. But ma'am, how does identity view come about? It's when an unlearned, ordinary person has not seen the noble ones and is neither skilled nor trained in the teaching of the noble ones. They have not seen good persons and are neither skilled nor trained in the teaching of the good persons. They regard form as self, self as having form, form in self, or self in form. They regard feeling, perception, thought forms or choices, consciousness as self, self as having consciousness, consciousness in self, or self in consciousness. That's how identity view comes about. But ma'am, how does identity view not come about? It's when a learned, noble disciple has seen the noble ones and is skilled and trained in the teaching of the noble ones. They have seen good persons and are skilled and trained in the teaching of the good persons. They don't regard form as self, self as having form, form in self, or self in form. They don't regard feeling, perception, choices, or thought forms, consciousness as self, self having consciousness, consciousness in self, or self in consciousness. That's how identity view does not come about. But ma'am, what is the Noble Eightfold Path? It is simply this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion. But ma'am, is the Noble Eightfold Path conditioned or unconditioned? The Noble Eightfold Path is conditioned. Are the 3 practice categories included in the Noble Eightfold Path? Or is the Noble Eightfold Path included in the three practice categories? The three practice categories are not included in the Noble Eightfold Path. Rather, the Noble Eightfold Path is included in the three practice categories: right speech, right action, and right livelihood. These things are included in the category of ethics. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion. These things are included in the category of immersion or concentration. Right view and right thought. These things are included in the category of wisdom. But ma'am, what is immersion? What things are the foundation of immersion? What things are the prerequisites for immersion? What is the development of immersion? Unification of the mind is immersion. The four kinds of mindfulness meditation are the foundations of immersion. The four right efforts are the prerequisites for immersion. The cultivation, development, and making much of these very same things is the development of immersion. How many processes are there? There are three processes: physical, verbal, and mental processes. But ma'am, what is the physical process? What's the verbal process? What's the mental process? Breathing is a physical process. Placing the mind and keeping it connected are verbal processes. Perception and feeling are mental processes. But ma'am, why is breathing a physical process? Why are placing the mind and keeping it connected verbal processes? Why are perception and feeling mental processes? Breathing is physical. It's tied up with the body. That's why breathing is a physical process. First, you place the mind and keep it connected. Then you break into speech. That's why placing the mind and keeping it connected are verbal processes. Perception and feeling are mental. They are tied up with the mind. That's why perception and feeling are mental processes. But ma'am, how does someone attain the cessation of perception and feeling? A mendicant who is entering such an attainment does not think, I will enter the cessation of feeling and perception, or I am entering the cessation of perception and feeling, or I have entered the cessation of perception and feeling. Rather, their mind has been previously developed so as to lead to such a state. But ma'am, which cease first for a mendicant who is entering the cessation of perception and feeling? Physical, verbal, or mental processes? Verbal processes cease first, then physical, then mental. But ma'am, how does someone emerge from the cessation of perception and feeling? A mendicant who is emerging from such an attainment does not think, I will emerge from the cessation of perception and feeling, or I am emerging from the cessation of perception and feeling, or I have emerged from the cessation of perception and feeling. Rather, their mind has been previously developed so as to lead to such a state. But ma'am, which arise first for a mendicant who is emerging from the cessation of perception and feeling? Is it physical, verbal, or mental processes? Mental processes arise first, followed by the physical, then verbal. But ma'am, when a mendicant has emerged from the attainment of the cessation of perception and feeling, how many kinds of contact do they experience? they experience three kinds of contact: emptiness, sightless, and undirected contacts. But ma'am, when a mendicant has emerged from the attainment of the cessation of perception and feeling, what does their mind slant, slope, and incline to? Their mind slants, slopes, and inclines to seclusion. But ma'am, how many feelings are there? There are three feelings: pleasant, painful, and neutral feelings. What are these three feelings? Anything felt physically or mentally as pleasant or enjoyable, this is pleasant feeling. Anything felt physically or mentally as painful or unpleasant, this is painful feelings. Anything felt physical or mentally as neither pleasurable nor painful, this is neutral feeling. What is pleasant and what is painful in each of the three feelings? Pleasant feeling is pleasant when it remains, and painful when it perishes. Painful feeling is painful when it remains, and pleasant when it perishes. Neutral feeling is pleasant when there is knowledge, and painful when there is ignorance. What underlying tendencies underlie each of these three feelings? The underlying tendency for greed underlies pleasant feeling. The underlying tendency for repulsion underlies painful feeling. The underlying tendency for ignorance underlies neutral feelings. Do these underlying tendencies always underlie these feelings? No, they do not. What should be given up? What should be given up in regard to each of these three feelings? The underlying tendency to greed should be given up when it comes to pleasant feelings. The underlying tendency to repulsion should be given up when it comes to painful feelings. The underlying tendency to ignorance should be given up when it comes to neutral feelings. Should these underlying tendencies be given up regarding all instances of these feelings? No, not in all instances. Take a mendicant or a spiritual seeker who, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption, or the first jhana, the state of mind absorption, which has the rapture or delight and bliss born of seclusion. Means the mind is quite secluded from sensual pleasure. It does not mean that you have to go to, specially fly to anywhere for a retreat in the forest. So while placing the mind and keeping it connected. So when you place the mind and keep it connected, and there is clarity in the mind, meaning there is no drowsiness, and you have no craving for sensual pleasures, then there is the experience of delight, also called rapture, and bliss, born of seclusion. With this, they give up greed. The underlying tendency to greed does not lie within that. And take a mendicant or spiritual seeker who reflects, oh, when will I enter and remain in the same dimension that the noble ones enter and remain in today? Nursing such a longing for the supreme liberations gives rise to sadness due to longing. With this, they give up repulsion. And the underlying tendency to repulsion does not lie within that. Take a mendicant who, giving up pleasure and pain and ending former happiness and sadness, enters and remains in the fourth absorption, without pleasure or pain, with pure equanimity and mindfulness. With this, they give up ignorance, and the underlying tendency to ignorance does not lie within that. But ma'am, What is the counterpart of pleasant feeling? Painful feeling. What is the counterpart of painful feeling? Pleasant feeling. What is the counterpart of neutral feeling? Ignorance. What is the counterpart of ignorance? Knowledge. What is the counterpart of knowledge? Freedom. What is the counterpart of freedom? Extinguishment. That means extinguishment of the grasping onto a self, which is the five aggregates. What is the counterpart of extinguishment? Your question goes too far, Visaka. You couldn't figure out the limit of questions. For extinguishment is the culmination, destination, and end of the spiritual life. If you wish, go to the Buddha and ask him this question. You should remember it in line with his answer. And then the layman Visaka approved and agreed with what the nun Dhammadhina said. He got up from his seat, bowed, and respectfully circled her, keeping her on his right. Then he went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and informed the Buddha of all they had discussed. When he had spoken, the Buddha said to him, "The nun Dhammadhina is astute, Visaka. She has great wisdom. If you came to me and asked this question, I will answer it in exactly the same way as the nun Dhammadhina. That is what it means, and that's how you should remember it." That is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, the layman Visaka was happy with what the Buddha said.